Welcome to this event. I'm Laura Chappell. I'm the Associate Director for International Publicity at the BioPR. I'm thrilled to be chairing this conversation on driving inclusive green prosperity, a new trade strategy for the UK, kindly sponsored by the So it feels like this is a really timely conversation to be having. Because we're potentially entering a whole new world for the UK's trade policy. Since 2016, feels like trade policy has been hinged around quite a political objective related to demonstrating the Brexit decision with success, including new FTAs became a sort of centrepiece of that project and a signal to the electorate that the right choice had been made. I think trade policy now has a completely different starting point, a really substantive one. The new government has been clear that they plan a more strategic and interventionist approach to economic policy, one that uses industrial strategy to drive growth and to shape its form, hence the inclusive and green angle of this conversation. And this message has, I think, come through just as clearly over this conference, not least with the Chancellor's speech yesterday. So if the sort of FTAs for FTA's sake approach is simply isn't going to do the job for this new era. It's also going to struggle to engage with other aspects of trade policy that are emerging that the UK urgently needs to consider. So some of the frontier issues, such as digital trade, and also the way in which trade policy globally is shifting away from multilateral institutions and rules and becoming more bilateral. So with a really hefty agenda on trade, I'm delighted we have this conversation today with such an eminent group. So I'll introduce them to my left. The Right Honourable Liam Byrne MP, who is the chair of the Business Committee. He's been a member of Parliament for Birmingham, Podge Hill and Solihull North, Birmingham, Podge Hill since 2004. To my right, Chris Hayward, Policy Chairman of the City of London Corporation, and in that role, he's the principal spokesperson and advocate for London as a global financial and professional services capital. Then down the far end, we have Tom Tucker, Director of Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute. And Todd has authored over 70 major reports referring to issues around trade, governance, industrial policy. Between Liam and Todd, we have Annie Menison, who's the Associate Director at SEC Newgate. And she's joined that organisation after a number of years in government, including most recently as a policy advisor for Secretary of State for Business Trade. And then last but very much not least, my colleague Marley Morris, who's the Associate Director for Migration, Trade and Communities IPPR. And Marley leads IPPR's work on migration and trade policy, where his studies include topics such as the distributional effects of Brexit. Any advice? Okay, I'll just try and public attitudes to immigration and trade. So I will come to each of you in turn. We've deliberately kept the scope broad, so please bring what you think is most pertinent to this conversation. But I've got a couple of framing questions for you to bear in mind. So firstly, how should the new government align its ambitious economic mission with an effective international trade strategy? Secondly, how can the UK deepen its trading relationship with the EU? What opportunities are there for closer cooperation? And thirdly, what trade measures can the UK use to grow and diversify its export base?
Right, thank you very much indeed. So I'll be very brief because we are this panel standing between you and the leader of the Labour Party and our Prime Minister. So I'll just speak for a few minutes, which, as I like to say, is the average lifespan of a Tory Chancellor. And I'm going to make just three very quick points. So one, just to state the obvious, to set the stage. We are now at the end of the hyper world. So that world of kind of hyper globalization, American hyperpower, that is now very much behind us. And we're now in a world of strategic competition, fragmentation of trade blocks. And there's not just one reason for that. It's not just about American and Chinese rivalry. The reality is that political support for globalization has plummeted around the world because the kind of hyper-globalization model that many of us built in the 1980s, 90s and beyond just wasn't delivering rising living standards for millions of people around the world. And so politicians, being people who like to get re-elected, are adjusting to that. And that's got really big implications for the kind of slowbalization that we now see. Slowbalization, which has been compounded obviously by the huge growth of military conflict around the world. So that's the kind of that sort of starting point. So if you're an island nation like ours, whose wealth is built in the world, what do you do about that? Well, the argument I want to give you today is that you've got to start deepening trade with trusted allies. And as it happens, if you look around the world, you can see 5 great circles of UK influence with trusted allies, which I would say you need to deepen. So if you go back to, say, Churchill's speech to the Tory Party conference in the 1940s, Churchill talked about British influence being concentrated in 3 majestic circles, Churchill's language. So the English-speaking world, the Commonwealth, and the British Empire, and of course, a united Europe. Now it's even more complicated than that. So we've obviously got great defence alliances like NATO, we've got our allies in Europe. We've got a really interesting complex of treaty negotiations, treaty allies in Asia Pacific, so the Five-Power Defence Agreement, Tempest Programme, AUKUS most significantly, and then we have the Commonwealth as well. So you probably, and the GCC. So you probably now got 3 majestic circles. You now got about 5 majestic circles. I suppose the good news for the United Kingdom is that the countries in those 5 circles cover about 90% of GDP globally. So deepening trade, thinking not just about security, but about economic security with those allies, is probably where we are going to make the most progress. Amongst those, obviously, people like me would say deepening our relationship with Europe is probably top of the tree. And we added up on the select committee the government's stated prize from all of the FTAs that have been negotiated. The figure comes to 784 billion. That is obviously dwarfed by the economic loss of leaving the European Union, which, depending on which numbers you use, is anywhere between 1.8 billion and 9.1 billion. So we are nowhere near touching the size of what we're lost, and therefore we're just thinking imaginatively about a new strategic relationship with President von der Leyen, that has probably got a big contribution to the strategic autonomy of the EU that is core, helping deliver that strategic autonomy, helping deliver economic security, helping deliver supply chain security, helping defence security. These are big spaces in which you can deepen the economic relationship. But I suppose the provocation that I want to give you is that the guiding principle in UK trade policy has got to be not simply about helping us become the fastest growing economy in the G7, as important as that is, but it should be prosecuting not merely a rules-based order, but a rights-based order. It is our country that helped author not just the UN Declaration of Human Rights all those years ago, but the ECHR too. We have a long tradition of rights in this country that goes back to the days of Magna Carta, and therefore thinking more creatively about how we foster the growth of 2 particular kinds of rights, labour rights and climate rights, is going to be a really important part of how we think about trade strategy in the future. So, simple example, we're having a big debate at the moment about Shein's potential listing on the London Stock Exchange. Is that a good idea or not? Well, the problem and the reason it is complicated is that we don't have an update to the Modern Slavery Act that was promised in 2022. And that means we don't have the kind of supply chain transparency and security when it comes to labour rights that they do in the United States. They've got it in a couple of ways. They've got the Week Enforced Labour Act, but they've also got the USMCA facility inspection mechanism. And things like that are going to be really important, not just in labour rights, but in climate rights too. So, for example, if you are worried about UK mining companies listed on the London Stock Exchange who are running facilities in, say, DRC, which are really important in negotiating critical minerals agreements. When you lack those kind of rapid stepping facilities that might allow you to inspect what's going on, that's going to be just a bigger topic of conversation in the future. And then finally, I think you're going to see more pressure on the kind of trade language that sometimes goes into these trade deals, which is, we notice that so-and-so country, our interlocutor, has signed up to this particular nationally defined contribution for reducing carbon rights, and we're going to urge them to honour their treaty obligations. I mean, I just think you're going to need to see things go a little bit further than that. Now, CBAM will obviously be one important tool in that, but I think there will be bigger and bigger pressure on just creating a good framework of labor standards and trade standards too, environmental standards too, and trade language. And then the final point I want to make really is please, 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 can we not forget soft power? This is a kind of a personal obsession of mine. I've just sort of, for particular interest, I've just sort of finished traveling the Silk Road over the course of the last 3 summers, through what is basically the collapse of the Russian Empire in space for this home to 155 million people. And what is so striking, if you're in the backstreets of Bukhara, they're not advertising Russian language teaching, they're advertising English language. If you talk to a policeman in the cafe next to the Friday Mosque in Samarkand, they love the fact that you're from Birmingham because Peaky Blinders is one of their favourite shows. The soft power assets that we've got, whether it's Premier League, whether it's BBC World Service, whether it is our great universities, the brilliant work of the Foreign Office, our international aid architecture, fundamentally, a world of trade is built on trust. And we have an enormous amount at our disposal to help us build that trust stronger and stronger for years.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me? Okay. Look, first of all, can I say how pleased I am that City of London is partnering again with the IPPR this year to bring you this particular event. And I think it goes without saying that a clear strategic trade strategy is a vital part of driving inclusive and green economic growth. And we know the government is going to bring forward a trade white paper. That's going to be incredibly important. And you'll be unsurprised to know that I'm going to be pitching to you this morning for the services sector. That's what I speak for, it's what I represent effectively. And 83% of jobs today in the United Kingdom are services based. And yet we have, I would suggest to you, a trade policy which doesn't recognise that. It recognises goods, but it doesn't play to our strengths in services. Despite generating an exporting surplus for financial services, we're the biggest exporter of financial services in the world, it's only about 45% of UK trade. And I think there's a huge opportunity to actually open that up. And there's lots of things that we can do in terms of trade in financial services. Now, I think about the EU first and foremost. So we've just done, or the last government did, the Berne Financial Services Agreement. So if you is FDIs, foreign direct investments. We've got the Global Investment Summit coming up very shortly. And that's a great opportunity to pitch the UK PLC and the opportunity to invest here. The challenge for us will be the timing of it means that the budget rather than before. And if I was an investor looking at the United Kingdom, I'd want to know about the tax regime. I'd want to know about, from a business perspective, are we globally competitive on our taxes? Now, the government can't put that right tomorrow, but it can set a course towards global competitiveness in business taxation. And I would strongly urge them to do that. FTAs, I think, are of course important, but I think they've become a little bit too much of celebrity status, if I can put it that way. We go around the world, we sign a big deal, minister appears in front of the cameras and says, isn't this great? Well, is it when you actually start to examine it? Some of these FTAs, if you don't follow through on them, for opportunities for UK businesses, they are just what they seem, a piece of paper. So I don't dismiss FTAs, but I do caution that they are not the answer in themselves to tackling our trade challenge. I do quite a bit of work with India. I travel the world promoting the City of London as the not a global financial services center, but the global financial services center. And if I think of, for example, in India, they are starting to liberalize their legal services. Now that's produces an opportunity for us in the United Kingdom. It's allowed me to sign an agreement with the Indian government, with the City of London, for an infrastructure bridge to bring expertise, legal expertise, project management expertise, capital financing towards Modi's infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure projects, which are phenomenal. So these are the sorts of opportunities that I think we need to tackle. And we do need to tap in, my final point really, to foreign sovereign investors. If we got more foreign sovereign investors, and we know incidentally that our competitors are doing this. We know what Singapore is doing, we know what others are doing. And we're not actually, I think, tapping into that market. I would like to see us incidentally have an inward investment agency. You know, you look at our competitor countries, that's what they do. They're out there really milking the world, and we're not doing that. So not just an investment minister, you need an inward investment agency as well, I would suggest. And we've just done some research that says that if you have these foreign sovereign investors coming into this country, the establishment of UK offices could bring an additional £7.7 billion of investment into this country by 2030. So there's huge opportunities out there. I suppose my point is to urge this government to think about flipping our trade policy, not to ignore goods, but more balance it out with the services sector.
Very much. Todd.
Great, thanks so much. Good to be with all of you today, and thanks to IPPR for organizing. I think my role on this panel as the American is to offer some of the lessons learned over the one of two. Great, exactly. Forgive me, but to offer some experience, you know, for the incoming Labor government, to offer some observations about the lessons learned from the last 3.5 years of Biden administration, change in trade policy, and some opportunities where I see collaboration between the U.S. and UK. So I think the big U.S. context, of course, is that they're sort of twin traumas, I would say, when it comes to trade policy. One is the economic trauma of what we call the China shock that economists like David Autor have studied, that have led to sort of very concentrated job losses in important parts of the United States. That in turn sort of led to a political trauma of the 2016 election, where trade policy went from being a somewhat marginal issue in US politics to sort of the center of it, and leading to unexpected results, I think, for many in Washington, with Donald Trump weaponizing the issue of trade to win the election. I think the solution to those twin traumas that we've seen from the last few years of the Biden administration have taken a few shapes and a few steps. I think the first was the recognition that for political legitimacy purposes, the focus, at least in the early part of the administration, needed to be on a domestic investment agenda, rather than sort of immediately turning to trade agreements or free trade agreements. And so that has been a spectacular success, I would say, between the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and the infrastructure law. We've seen 6 quarters of record-busting manufacturing construction in the U.S., record-breaking, hires for construction workers. Very significant results. All 5 of the largest chips manufacturers in the world are now beginning to build up their operations in the U.S. for the first time. And so, potentially, you have potentially about $1 trillion of public dollars that are crowding in, about 6 to 10 times that from the private sector. So that's been a huge success. And actually, I should say 46% of the announced investment has been in the form of foreign direct investment from, among other countries, Japan, Korea, and UK. So that's been quite significant. I think the flip side of spending trillions of dollars as part of your climate industrial strategy, I think was inevitably going to be some type of trade defense mechanism on the backstop to backstop that investment. We've seen this story in the US before, where Obama invested $90 billion in the clean energy industry, only to see that largely offshored. Another aspect of this new model has labor enforcement. The minister mentioned the rapid response mechanism as part of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. I think this has been a total game changer. I don't know about you, but when I've gone to Brussels or other capitals, there's a lot of interest in how this is working. And to just give sort of the brief synopsis, it gives, instead of sort of having labor rights be a secondary part of trade agreements or something that's litigated between trade or foreign ministries over a number of years, this new mechanism envisions a shipment by shipment, facility by facility enforcement mechanism, so that if a worker is fired for organizing, for utilizing their collective bargaining rights or other forms of labor rights, that can get reported basically immediately, and ultimately within a matter of weeks or months, those goods from that facility can be impounded at the customs house and not released until the worker's reinstated. So the estimates are that that's led to improvement in workers' rights for up to 30,000 Mexican workers, which of course then has also a beneficial effect for U.S. workers that are not in competition with workers that are being fired for exercising their labor rights. I think another part of the new strategy has been a real focus moving away from economy-wide trade agreements towards sectoral agreements. That's particularly, I think, sort of one of the highlights there, and this is something Marley and I have worked on and talked about over the years, but bilateral and sectoral agreements on free trade and decarbonized goods. So the high point of that, I would say, is the ongoing negotiations on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum between the US and EU. I would say that if you're looking for an opportunity, especially with the Harris administration, of where to focus sort of UK-US bilateral energy, I would say something like that between the UK and US around steel and aluminum would be a real promising place to start. I think the way the US is looking at those kind of sectoral deals, it's a bit of a trust building and proof of concept, so that if it works there, you can then begin to expand it into additional sectors. So I think there's a lot of appetite for that. And then I guess I'll just say a couple of other quick things. I think, another element of the new US trade strategy has been a different kind of geometry, if you will, of trade agreements. So we've, seen the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework between the US and 13, 14 other economies. And it's been a bit more of an a la carte approach where, countries can sign up to the parts of the deal that make sense for them. I think that the result of that, we can debate, and it is debated, sort of how effectual some of this model has been. But I think one thing that's hard to argue with is that they, instead of, years or a decade of trade negotiation, you got at least something over the finish line within a matter of months. And I think the hope is that that is then used as a platform, and we're already kind of seeing that this happen. This is a platform to engage investors across the region, to less sort of a rules-based trade agreement and more of a platform for deal making between the private sector and public sector investors, and that's starting to have some real impact. And then I would just say, sort of finally, the one thing I haven't mentioned is the 2020 the election this year, 2024 election, and the different possible outcomes. Like I said, I think with a Harris victory, you're going to see some continuity with the Biden administration, but also a real openness to more fully integrating climate and trade policy. That's sort of been her track record as a politician. And I think that even some of these opportunities don't totally go away under a Trump administration as well. I think that there's significant Republican support on Capitol Hill for innovating in some of this space as it relates to things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and similar policies. So I think there are some opportunities there. So I'll stop there.
So much. Hi.
Yeah, my mother would probably kill me for leading on the fact that I have American first, she's British as the day they come. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the inclusivity part of trade policy, so sustainability, pick up kind of the EU question, and then also implementation. One of the things that I really, really like and would like to see the UK move more towards, so that we don't have just this inexorable focus on free trade deals, is the kind of the enhanced trade partnership approach to trade policy and economic partnerships. Because I think that allows for a much broader overarching framework of what we want our economic relations with overseas countries to cover. It allows for more factoring in of investment sort of facilitation around sort of the green transition. It allows for more sort of sector by sector kind of approach. The FTA is part of that. So, for example, with India, the FTA, despite having been the main focus, is actually part of that ETP approach. It looks at things like mobility. It looks at things like sort of ad hoc market access deals that we've had done a couple of. So I think that it's really important to make sure that we look at sort of trade investment as part of kind of an overarching framework approach to bilateral relations. On inclusive sort of trade policy, I'm really passionate about the idea that you sort of try and look at how you make trade policy relevant to a much wider group of stakeholders. I remember when I was in government, I came across like an off-license in London shop that had a cereal box that had basically one had been produced in Canada, one had been produced in the US, totally different prices. We only have a trade deal with Canada, and surprise, that was the much lower actually price on the box. Now I may be over extrapolating this sort of pass through effective tariffs, but I like ran to my DG's desk and I was like, this is trade policy in action. So I really think it's important to try and make trade policy sort of come alive to a much broader group of stakeholders. That also means that instead of just focusing on the consultations to FTAs, we include whether it's in the development community, NGOs, trade unions, and sort of figuring out what is our strategy for our overarching economic relations with countries. Because I think too often in government, having seen it up close, that we tend to kind of just do a box tick approach to engagement of people outside of the business community. And in fact, there's a lot of areas that are quite relevant for both financial services, for sort of NGOs. I'll give you a great example. So remittance payments, what are the kind of mechanisms that we need to do in terms of our regulatory relations with other countries? It makes it easier for people to be able to send their remittances back home. Very important for obviously people from across the world, not least with the kind of the influx of people coming from places like Ukraine and other parts of the world. That to me is sort of an example of trying to make trade and investment policy come alive. And then on sustainability, it's interesting that one of the, as an example, one of the things that I think we looked at in government, decided not to proceed with, the ACCTS, this is an agreement on trade, sustainability, and climate change between Costa Rica, New Zealand, Iceland, and Switzerland. And I think we basically sort of decided not to do it because of some of the limitations that might have been placed on us in terms of subsidies for fossil fuels. There are actually exceptions in agreements like that. So if you're really serious actually about trying to take some of these provisions forward that make trade policy focus on sustainability, there are ways to actually go about doing that. The other part I wanted to talk about was sort of the UK is a sort of enabler of trade. We're not the US, we're not the EU anymore, but we do have a role in basically sort of facilitating trade, whether it's in goods, services for goods. And I think that if you're in the manufacturing sector, there tends to be a sort of, at least in the public perceptions, to focus on trade policy is what are your tariffs, what are your TBTs? When in fact, actually, we should be looking at what is needed for the services inputs for goods. Some people in the wonk world in sort of trade policy call that sort of mode 5 for services. What are the things that we need to facilitate kind of movement of professionals to do kind of green projects, including with India? Financial inclusion, if we're talking about sort of, unlocking barriers, looking at some of labor's missions, inclusive growth. India is doing some really interesting stuff around sort of making access to sort of pension payments in country. We're doing sort of, labor has committed to a national financial inclusion strategy. I really think that when we talk about our kind of overarching economic relations frameworks with India, we should be looking at some of that as for one example. And then lastly, I wanted to come to implementation. So this is something that was a real bugbear of mine in government, that there was a big focus on the negotiating of the FTAs, but not about actually getting stakeholders to make use of that. And that's not just businesses, that's trade unions looking at monitoring the implementation of commitments after we've done it. When I arrived in government, there was a team that focused on negotiating FTAs, but not really anything in place. It's since been improved, thankfully, on the implementation of that. That's a bilateral discussion, follow-up between countries. Give you an example, some of the regulatory frameworks and commitments that we made relied on basically regulators from other countries following that up. And I think that's a really important sort of conversation, not just for regulators, but for stakeholders as well. An FTA or a trade policy instrument is only as important, only as useful as the stakeholders are going to make use of it. So I think I'm really keen to sort of see the UK move from being a country that has talked for so long about how many FTAs it does to how do we actually encourage the take up and the spreading the benefits of not only the FTAs, the trade policy agreements, but their implementation. One last example of that, one of the things that I think I'm most proud of what we did in government, and just to clarify, I was a civil servant policy advisor, not a political span. is working on basically our preference scheme for developing countries. And we kind of overhauled that. It wasn't perfect, but I know that actually quite a few people in the US and the development community think that they'd love to replicate that. We even got a sort of great report on that from the UN, one of the UN economic development agencies. And I would love to see actually when it comes to encouraging businesses who are here in terms of the relationship between people who migrated to the UK from other countries, from least developed countries, the take up of those preferences. You know, I think during Brexit, a lot of businesses and other stakeholders got used to dealing with trade policy in kind of a negative change scenario. I'd like to turn that around and say, well, we've kind of had to build up some of this expertise in how do we make use of trade policy in a negative change scenario. Let's move that towards a more positive one.
Molly.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to reflect, I think, on many of the points made by the panel being the last, but I'll try and add some new thoughts. I think it's really important just to reflect. I mean, the government have talked a lot about their inheritance, but looking in particular at the inheritance on trade, it is quite striking. The policy in the last few years has really translated into a strikingly lackluster picture for UK trade flows. The goods exports in particular have struggled to recover since the pandemic. In 2023, they were 11% lower in real terms than in 2019. And that's both for EU and non-EU goods exports. So it's not just about Brexit, it's a wider issue with goods exports. Services exports, saying they've held up very well, but goods, we're in a real pickle, and things have stayed stagnated for a number of years now. At the same time, clearly COVID has exposed serious vulnerability to global supply chain disruptions. And I think it's interesting to reflect on what Todd was saying, how far the UK strategy has been out of step with our allies in the US and the EU. Our focus has been, as Laura was saying, on wrapping up these FDAs post-Brexit, but simply hasn't been this consideration about how that fits into a wider green industrial strategy. And we've been left behind really compared to where the US and where the EU have been on thinking much more strategically about how this fits into domestic policy. So we think a new approach is needed. And we're doing some work on this IPPR. I'll just give some initial reflections about where our early thinking is. So first of all, we think that we need to use the trade tools we have available to support the government's industrial strategy, which is, I think, now set to be published next month. So we've done some work at IPPR looking at where there are specific strengths for green industry, a report called Manufacturing Matters. And then that looks at where we can focus on areas that are core to the net zero transition, where either we have a current comparative advantage or where we can actually build a comparative advantage over time. So areas such as monitoring and measuring of greenhouse gas emissions, where we currently have that advantage, or areas where we have the potential to develop. So for instance, in wind manufacturing and heat pumps in particular. And really this shows that where there are clear areas and clear sectors and industries where we need to be focusing our efforts. We need to think about how our trade policy should implement and support those areas in particular. And reflecting on what Ali was saying, there's no point getting these FTAs if we're not going to make use of them. And I think there needs to be a much more coherent approach to export finance, to trade promotion, to supporting businesses, particularly small businesses, to make use of these FTAs, particularly in those industries where we think we might have potential to grow in future, to really expand and diversify our export base. As I said, trying to address that real deficit at the moment when it comes to our goods exports. The second area where we're keen to think further about strengthening our strategy on trade is to force the UK-EU relationship, which is critical trade out and has been a huge impact on our current trade position in the last few years. It's gone under the radar a lot, but businesses, particularly small businesses, have been really struggling with with the new trade rules under the TCA, and of course that's had a huge impact on not only on overall trade flows but also the diversity of trade between the UK and the EU. Smaller businesses have been priced out by these new barriers. And there are three areas in particular I just briefly highlight. One is on energy and climate, where I think there are lots of opportunities for the UK and the EU to build on the TCA, whether that's about improving the efficiency of energy trading, or whether it's about building on some of the provisions in the TCA which explore the opportunity for linking our emissions trading systems. And I think there's an opportunity to ensure not only that we're coordinating our ETS systems together, but that we're also planning to avoid the potential implications of the EU's carbon border adjust mechanism, which is coming down the track, which could have a huge impact on some UK industries, particularly on electricity trading. And so there's a real opportunity there for the UK and the EU to coordinate together, so they're actually designing CBAM hand in hand, and that helps to avoid those trade barriers, and also helps to allow for a more coordinated picture globally when it comes to navigating some of these trade tensions around CBAMs. And then secondly, as I mentioned, there are these huge barriers to trade which exporters and importers are currently facing when it comes to the UK-EU relationship. I think some of these are baked in; they're not gonna change, and some of it's about adapting and saying what the UK can do unilaterally to adapt our customs process to this new model. But there are, I think, some areas where we can make progress, and obviously the government has already talked about a veterinary agreement, which would help in particular when it comes to transport of agri-food products. I think there's also other areas where we can try and smooth some of the trade flows, for instance, around mutual recognition agreements on conformity assessments, which feels like a real gap in the TCA currently. And then finally, probably the most controversial area, but I think where I know there is a real concern from business, particularly when it comes to services trade, is around mobility, particularly business mobility. There's a real gap again in the TCA, and there's an opportunity there to do more thinking both on business mobility, but also on mutual recognition of professional qualifications. I think it's quite likely that part of the conversation will have to involve youth mobility, which we know is a tricky area. But I think, again, there's an opportunity there. I think the initial proposal put forward by the EU, I think is probably not going to work, but I think there is scope for some negotiations. We do have youth mobility agreements with many other countries. I don't see why it wouldn't be possible to do that with the EU as well. And then finally, the third area for us is on modernising our trade agreements. I think we've heard a lot about the fact that FTAs, the current approach that the UK is taking, doesn't really work for our economy, and has reached its limits. And we've got our FTAs with Australia and New Zealand. We're trying to secure something with India, of course, accession to the CPTPP, but where else do we go, particularly if the US isn't playing ball? So I think we need to think a bit more imaginatively about what economic cooperation agreements could look like. As Todd mentioned, you've got the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the US is developing. I think there are lessons that we can learn from IPEF, in particular thinking about how we develop the, in a few areas where I think there are ways to look beyond just simply market access in trade agreements, but think a bit more creatively about regulatory cooperation, about other areas. Just mention a couple. One, the digital economy, which I think is a real area where the UK has potential strengths, and where I think there's opportunities. Obviously, we have to deal with Singapore, which the previous government held up as a kind of path breaking model, and I think there are opportunities to build on that with other countries. Secondly, on supply chain resilience, that's been a big part of IPEF, and I think there's much more that we can do to support more effective coordination on monitoring and responding to potential supply chain vulnerabilities, particularly with key countries where we want to develop those important supply chains, for instance, where there are critical materials where we'll need to be developing partnerships. And then thirdly, as it's already been discussed, and I think Leah mentioned at the start, on labour and environmental standards. I think, again, this is an area where the last government, I think, probably was quite out of step with our allies, but where I think there's now lots more opportunity to work with the US and the EU and other allies on how you can build climate and labour rights agreements into trade policy, and lots of potential there. But I'll leave it there for now before my voice completely goes. And yeah, really good to be at this discussion. We're going to be doing more work on this, so kind of keen to get everyone else's thoughts.
This is the part of the event where I meant to ask questions. I feel like we should potentially instead try and release you so you can all go and see the Prime Minister's speech if you have interest to do that. So in which case I suggest we close slightly early at 1:30 instead of the scheduled 1:45. So I am going to step out and just hand over to you guys for your questions and put those to the panel. So who has questions up here?
Thanks very much. I'm Kira Box from Friends of the Air, and it's really refreshing and really positive to hear from a government that they are interested in developing a holistic trade strategy, that we will see a white paper. And I suppose my question is, can we expect to see a strategy out of this government that involves multi-departmental engagement, including from those working in development and those working in the green transition in the UK and abroad? And can we also expect to see a policy which involves reviewing existing trading agreements so that where they contain unhelpful things like poor enforcement, like a lack of implementation measures, or indeed like investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, we might see those removed to have better trade where we have currently poor non-green and damaging trade?
Ruth Bergen from Transform Trade. The panel mentioned some of the climate-related trade measures that's coming up. Liam talked about CBAM. Some of these are very welcome, and we need things like deforestation due diligence. We probably need a CBAM. The problem that we see working with partners in the Global South is that they are experiencing this as a set of new standards created in the North for which they will have to do the work. They will have to fulfill the paperwork, they will have to measure the emissions, and there's nothing there. So they've not been included in the conversation first, and they aren't sure how they're going to pay for this, how they're going to implement it. So my question for the panel is, how can we get better at recognizing that climate change and biodiversity loss are global issues, and therefore we need to include our partners in the conversation? Because frankly, if they see too much coming down the pipeline, they'll go and trade elsewhere, and we will have not fulfilled our aims. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mark English from European Movement UK. Very short question. China has low costs still. The US has enormous subsidies, as we've heard, and the EU has the single market. How can the UK compete with any or all of them?
Thank you. Liam, I'll turn first to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I should just sort of reference, I think it's chapter 5, isn't it, of the Council of Economic Advisors report to the United States President, trade chapter, I think. And for those of you who are kind of looking for just a really good set of arguments, that is a really good place to look. The published about March. It is just one of the best distillations of what a modern, progressive, sense-led trade strategy should look at. Now, you know, if we get a UK Labour government trade strategy that looks a little bit like the report from the Council of Economic Advisors, I think we've done well. I know that the UK government is getting the best advice from the Council of Economic Advisors on precisely some of those questions. So Mark, let me start with your question. So basically, what do we have to do? We basically have to deepen cooperation with Europe everywhere. We have to deepen cooperation with America where we can. And when it comes to China, we've actually got to start putting up guardrails, which we just don't have today. So there's a real question about why we're not following the EU's anti-competition subsidy investigations. We've launched 4 now. We've not followed them. We are very vulnerable therefore to Chinese dumping. And there's a kind of real question about whether we need trade defences now. We're just not standing up. There's what I said around supply trade transparency. That's not there. Either CBAM will do some of the work we need to do on our carbon emissions, but ultimately we've got to start putting values into our trade strategy in a way that we just haven't over the last 15 years. So then on the trade white paper and the kind of conversation that floats out in particular. This is obviously just part of a much bigger conversation that has happened this year. So this year we marked the 80th anniversary of the institutions. And with another hat on, I chair the International Parliamentary Network on the World Bank and America. We now see just this twin crisis. On the one hand, you've got what I call the 7 giants blocking the road to the SDGs. Getting bigger and bigger, but on the other hand, look, the world is into a fiscal crunch this year. We've got debt now approaching nearly 100% of global GDP. We've got new pressures from pensions, from healthcare, from defence. They've got about another 7 to 8% of GDP in fiscal pressure. You've got to end basically the global savings go up as you move into quantitative tightening. That's going to create an upward pressure on rates, which are going to hurt developing countries too. So the trade conversation has just got to come as part and parcel of a much bigger conversation about both development as well as the reinvention of Bretton institutions for new times. Trade is an important part of it, but there is just a much bigger reckoning that I'm afraid we're going to have to get through over the course of the next couple of years, because otherwise, if we don't do this in 482 weeks' time, as we approach the next general election, we will be just a little bit short of the 2030 target of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it will become clear that the world is just off track to hit those goals. Now, that is not a position that I want Labour to go into the next election with. So, the time for action is now, and I think once the Prime Minister finishes his speech, gets on the plane to Ungar, he's going to start those conversations.
Yeah, cross-government coordination. I mean, I actually think, I don't know if everyone agrees on this, but I thought it was a very good move by the previous Prime Minister, albeit belated, to integrate business and trade as departments, because before there was a lot of jockeying for position. Sometimes sectors would play one department against another. But what I found was that very often, every department kind of had like an international team go off and do bits, and we'd only kind of find out at the end, or vice versa. And I genuinely think that having an industrial strategy, trade strategy, is a bit of a chicken and egg. Do you have your international sort of strands running through the whole industrial strategy? Do you have the industrial strategy, which comes first in effect? But I think if you're looking at kind of Labour's missions of inclusive growth, the sort of green transition, the industrial strategy and the trade strategy are really good ways to make sure the departments aren't going off and doing their own thing ad hoc, and they're actually coming together from a strategy point to begin with at the start. Because what I think very often happened that I saw in government was, different departments get yanked into, for example, FTA negotiations, but they were still really, really super siloed. Whereas if you're actually having the discussions with the departments as a whole together as part of the strategy, whether it's on trade or industry, you can say, what is every department's team doing in terms of its international focus to reinforce inclusive growth, to reinforce sustainability, instead of basically coming almost together at the end of sort of the policy discussions where you're like, well, actually, by the way, my department's doing this, my department's doing that. And actually they fit retrospectively into a narrative. You're trying to create the actual narrative that informs the policy approach sort of first afterwards. I mean, interesting question on deforestation regulation. I was in Geneva a couple of weeks ago where I was absolutely stunned by the level of criticism, overt public criticism in a place like Geneva that's focused on consensus-based kind of decision-making of the EU by a lot of the global South countries. And so I think, just to echo what Liam was saying, there was nothing that really intense regulatory cooperation cannot help try and solve. So that, I don't know necessarily what the UK's plans might be in terms of mimicking any kind of work on deforestation, but they should really make sure that that's informing their relations with not just countries in the global South, particularly the global South. It's an interesting thing from the that we do in the US, which is kind of a sort of notice and comment period when kind of legislation is being developed. And even though I don't think we need to wait for kind of trade partnerships or roadmaps or whatever with other countries to do that, I'm a big believer in making sure that you are running through your regulatory sort of intents with your other countries. It doesn't mean they get to actually sort of literally notice and comment and sort of change the outlook of it, but it means that it's not a huge surprise. And you can look at where some of the flexibilities are, and you look at the, dare I say, extraterritorial impact of what you're doing domestically.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to come back on those, or should we go through them around?
I'll just briefly comment on Ruth, on your point. I mean, I think it's absolutely real challenge that we're grappling with IPPR, we're thinking through. And obviously there are ways that you can mitigate some of these impacts through exempting countries, through providing additional support, technologies and so on. So there are other options. I think one of the challenges is that at the moment the UK is to some extent following the lead from the EU because it has to follow, because otherwise it risks trade diversion, it risks falling too far behind. And so I do think actually getting on the front foot and developing these things more quickly would allow it to set the agenda a bit more, so that it's able to develop an approach that that would be more progressive, that would address some of these concerns, rather than just having to sort of follow suit from after the EU's done something, because it needs to address the risk of trade damage.
Fantastic. Right, and then another round. We'll go here, then here.
James Dalton, I'm not representing anybody, I'm the Labour Party. So my question, Liam, you mentioned globalization and the sort of trend against that coming up. Part of the trend, but the reason for that is because of the reason people go for globalization is because it's going to lower labour costs and lower other regulatory costs, but particularly green costs. And so to some extent, the effect has been to actually worsen the green agenda, in my view, by moving manufacturing away from centres in Europe and the US to perhaps areas where really more pollution is being produced and there's more transport involved in it. So I was really interested in what Todd said in terms of the rapid response mechanism for labour. Should there not be a similar mechanism for a green agenda, so that actually there is more of a level playing field in all of these free trade agreements?
Thanks. It's Libby Peake from Green Alliance, and just an observation that the UK isn't just an island nation, it's also a resource poor nation. And we currently import nearly 100% of every single material that's considered to have high or elevated criticality. And insofar as previous administrations have attempted to deal with it, the emphasis has always been on diversifying trade. But that will only get you so far. And so I wonder if the panel thinks that we should be thinking more creatively and doing more other sorts of interventions other than just looking to get different sources that everybody else is trying to cultivate as well. So you could, for instance, reduce your demand for energy, which would cut your need for cobalt and lithium by up to 50%. You could do things like stop exporting nearly 100% of the materials that we accumulate in the infrastructure and products around us, which is what currently happens, and I suppose is another aspect of trade policy.
Sharon Todd, Chief Executive of SCI. We're an industrial and scientific innovator. Actually related to both of those questions, can we think more creatively about trade policy in the light of industrial strategy and the drive for economic growth, which ultimately we all want? Interesting comments about the Inflation Reduction Act, etc. You know, those countries have assessed where their core capabilities lie in energy, in cost, etc. The UK has an incredible science base, which we do not believe has been effectively monetized for value in the UK. We've actually done some work on this and assessing GBA, etc. I'm interested in the panel's views on how can we monetize our investment in science and really create value in the UK, jobs, manufacturing jobs, R&D jobs, and also exports from that great base. Perhaps just a little sting in the tail at the end of my question. The comment about driving investment offices into the UK is great, but actually a large proportion of them are actually seeking out our science startups and taking them elsewhere for monetization. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Todd, can I come to you?
Sure, absolutely. Rapid response mechanism for climate, absolutely. You've telepathically sensed what many of us in the US are talking about quite a lot these days, which is in 2026, there'll be a review of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. And I believe, that is something that a lot of the research organizations, environmental groups are advocating, trying to think through what it would look like to have something that's facility specific, shipment specific. It's a little, there's some distinct challenges when it comes to decarbonization relative to labor rights, but we are optimistic we can think through sort of an alternative model that would apply there. I think that's going to be helped quite a lot by some of the research and analytics work that's been happening between the US and EU to try to get a better handle on the embedded emissions in different products and product lines. So I think that's something very much that we're looking at. I think just briefly wasn't addressed to me, but on the criticality point of the imports, one of the things that we've been building out quite a lot in the US over the last few years is, again, sort of the analytic capacity to look at some of these questions. There's a new tool that's been launched by our Department of Commerce that looks at the combination of criticality, importance to the US economy, resilience, and a few different range of metrics, so that they're profiling essentially several hundred different industries by the degree of exposure on those different metrics. And that's maybe something that could be useful and potentially important.
Fantastic. Chris, did you want to add on any of those?
I just want to pick up on and it's been mentioned actually across a whole range of questions, the whole question of green and green trade. I think this is pretty important actually, because for me, the transition to green requires government continuity, consistency, and commitment. And I wouldn't say we've always seen that from government. We see, I'm looking to the world of where private finance contributes to and we know private finance is the answer to get to net zero. There's not enough public finance in the world to do it. But we do in the City of London, we think we're pretty much thought leaders on this whole area of green finance. We have some of the great green finance products actually in the world. But I do urge this government to remain committed and consistent to this agenda, because it's very, very easy to get blown off track. I've seen that before, whether it's on targets. And once you start to do that, you undermine the confidence investors will have in terms of investing in a green future. That's the only point I want to pick up. Just on the green.
Sure, just to pick up your question. So, I mean, I can think of a really specific example, but I'm not sure if this is where you were going with your question. And one of the things that we talked a lot about in Geneva was basically the use of biotechnology in trying to sort of tackle some of the world's biggest challenges, drought, crop resistance, etc. Sort of reducing the use of pesticides. And I actually think that this is a really interesting area at a domestic level, but also B, for increased cooperation with, for example, everyone from the EU to India. So as an example, we have once we left the EU, we decided to basically sort of make it easier to do some genetic editing. I know that it's sort of sensitive in some sort of constituencies, but it's sort of hived off from sort of GMOs as a whole. The EU is now doing some of that. I think we're actually potentially starting to lose the race potentially to Europe because we haven't brought forward the secondary legislation to actually bring those products to market for authorization. Having said that, if we can move on that, the EU is also moving in that direction. The European Parliament recently moved towards basically having its own set of new genomic techniques in this space. And I think there's a really interesting intersection between sort of tackling climate change, sustainability, sort of development policy, and also sort of being able to export British know-how, including countries like India, where basically we should be looking at our not just trade policy, but our economic relations and saying, well, what is it that we need when we're doing our sort of bilateral formal relations with countries or our investment sort of provisions that actually facilitates the flow of not only sort of British capital, but also people for some of these projects. We have a huge amount of expertise in it. And I think that actually the industrial strategy, we had a lot of criticism from at times people in the life sciences sector that they didn't think that our life sciences were not a priority in the trade negotiations. Well, if you have an industrial policy that says, without overly picking winners, but it looks at things both vertically and horizontally across sectors, you say, how does our priorities to sort of grow the life sciences sector inform the negotiation positions that we take? Now, I'm not saying that lots of other stakeholder constituencies might have the same view on things like patents. We saw that with the vaccine waiver at the WTO. But I do think that there's an opportunity to sort of look at how does our expertise in some of these areas, not just monetize it, but how can we actually adopt a trade and investment policy that allows us to actually facilitate that to other parts of the world and actually intersects with our climate and sustainability policy and trying to promote development.
Fantastic. Did William, did you want to come back?
I mean, I just want to be upfront about the one dilemma that is looming in all of this that we've not really talked about yet. So the industrial strategy that we prosecute is going to do three things. It's going to decarbonize, de-risk, and decentralize the country. But it's got to do one thing over and above all of that, which is got to lean into our capacity advantages. And what we've then got to effect is a new balance between trade strategy abroad, industrial policy. So the trade strategy that we put into place has got to leverage the industrial policy that we put in place in the UK. But of course, when you speak to employers about what is it that is going to, what needs to be true if an industrial policy is actually going to change the way our economy works, what is the one thing they say? People. And the reality is that we don't have all of the people and we don't have all of the skills that we need in order to deliver that industrial strategy and move growth from about 1% growth to about 1.5%, which is what it needs to be if we're to deliver the fastest growth in the G7. And therefore, the dilemma that we're going to have to navigate in the Labour Party is how do we couple industrial policy, trade strategy, and actually an immigration strategy that might actually make sense.
Molly, did you want to come back any questions?
I mean, I agree. Absolutely. I do. The fourth strategy I put in there is also a skill strategy as well, which I think it needs to be complemented.
Fantastic. We have achieved our goal of finishing 15 minutes, well, 14 minutes early. So I think that's been a really stimulating conversation and looking at a lot of the different aspects of what trade strategy will do to tackle next. So please just join me in saying thank you.